We appreciate your being here, and we look forward to our discussion and conversation together. So what we'd like to do today is we'd like to just start by going over sort of three things that are key to navigating a caregiver role, especially in the context of being a caregiver to someone living with dementia. The first is really navigating that first stage of the illness when you're wondering maybe if your care partner, your care recipient has dementia, and we'll talk about that for a few minutes. We'll talk about once you have the diagnosis, navigating this new role of being a caregiver, caring as a new skill, and then difficult choices. And the way we're going to do this is that Judy and I are going to sort of go back and forth and reflect. And at the beginning of each of these sections, we'll get to hear from Judy and her expertise as a caregiver and what she's learned through the process. So the first question is the question of how do I know that my care recipient, my loved one, has dementia? And Judy, I'd like to start by asking you, when you were first navigating this experience with your husband Steve, what were some of the clues or things that sort of made you wonder and potentially worry that this might be going on?
So I think, Christine, to start off doing that, it's kind of good to give a little synopsis of who Steve was so I could understand what it was. So people can understand what it was that made me ask questions. So Steve was the most attentive and loving care partner, father, grandfather, and friend. And in fact, he did the lion's share of taking care of us and our family in the first 30 years of our marriage. He was a son that his parents turned to for assistance, and in particular, when his mother had been diagnosed with Alzheimer's. He managed our finances, the upkeep of our home, and always had some sort of construction project going on at our house or at the family beach house. And he was always building a deck for someone or putting together a set for our kids' school productions. He worked as a construction project manager at Northeastern University and managed multi-million-dollar projects. I like to say, though, that his most astounding accomplishment was building our do-it-yourself in-ground pool. That was not a job for the faint of heart. He was an avid reader and an exerciser. So in 2011, when some things began to go amiss, I began questioning what might be happening. Things like losing his keys at work or repeatedly forgetting our bank passwords, or waking up from a nap in our living room and being confused about who had changed the furniture around when he, in fact, had done it himself. We tried to chalk some of this up to tiredness and trying to do too much all the time. And we avoided discussing it at length because we felt at age 58, he was too young to have memory issues. We even one time asked his general practitioner about his memory, and he responded, until you have problems at work, I wouldn't worry about it. People get tired as they age. And he said it might be that he's just trying to juggle too much. But on May 5th, 2011, Steve returned home from work devastated because he received a poor performance report at work. One of the things that they had noticed at work is that he had compiled a complex financial report and went in to put it on his supervisor's desk and laid it down on top of the very same report he had already done and had no recollection of doing. We decided after he got that report from work that we would rather know what was going on rather than try to run and evade. So we reached out to his doctor immediately and began 5 months of testing that led us eventually to the diagnosis of younger onset Alzheimer's. So in short, I would say the best thing to do when you're observing some of these things that seem a little more amiss than what you're used to is to reach out to your doctor, talk about it openly with each other, and try to seek care and a diagnosis.
Thanks, Judy. And what Judy and I will do is we'll talk about both of our respective experiences, Judy with her rich experience with her husband, Steve, and me with my experience with my father, who had Lewy body dementia. And I was telling Judy that my father was really a hero to me, one of my first and longstanding mentors. And he was a head and neck cancer surgeon who devoted his entire life to caring for those who are in the challenging place of experiencing that kind of cancer, and was one of the most geographically astute people I know. He didn't need a compass to figure out what was going on. He was a sailor. He'd been in the Navy. And I knew actually something was up with him when we were actually picking him up from Logan Airport and driving straight to Watertown. So basically due west. And he said to me, "So are we going east?" And for many people, that would be an innocuous and frankly not meaningful question. But for someone with his background and his skills, I knew something was going on. So what are those things to think about in terms of what might be going on with your loved one? Well, the things that are sort of high on the list are memory that can disrupt daily life, remembering that not everybody with dementia actually has memory as their first and foremost feature. For their cognitive changes. Maybe it's challenges in planning or solving problems, completing familiar tasks. So they're starting to have trouble with the microwave or other things that, their cell phone or other things they've been doing for a long time, and suddenly they just don't seem to work as well. One of my good friends who's now navigating this journey with his wife described how she always knew the code to get in through the garage door, and then now is having difficulty with the code to get in through the garage door. Confusion with time or place. And Judy noted this with her husband, where he woke up and thought that the furniture had been moved around. Sometimes people will wake up and not recognize where they are. Problems with words or speakings or word finding, more than just that one thing where you can't remember the name of somebody and then you remember it later, but truly having a consistent challenge with that. Some people have decreased or poor judgment. Some people will just withdraw. So they may not talk about what's going on, but they start becoming more anxious in situations that in the past brought them joy, and they will withdraw from work and social activities. Some people become more anxious. So these are the sort of clues that something may be going awry. And especially if these things are not just sort of happenstance or associated with maybe one event, but are happening over and over again, that's room for further evaluation. So most of you probably know how dementia is diagnosed, but just to sort of put it out there, it's evolving. And I think as the next years unfold, as we see new research coming into play, we're going to have more non-invasive approaches towards diagnosing dementia than we have in the past. Always we evaluate family history, because family history does serve as a useful indicator of risk for the development of dementia. Mental ability tests, neurologic exam. Increasingly, blood tests may be something that we see as being relevant going forward, genetic tests and brain imaging. Now, some people are not terribly enthusiastic about actually getting this kind of evaluation. And I have to say, probably for any of us, this would be scary if it were us that were experiencing these things. And so I would like to just sort of briefly discuss with you why it's worth going to the trouble of getting a diagnosis. The first is that many people, most people, want to know. In one study where there were over 1,000 people evaluated at a memory clinic, by and large, people said they wanted to be informed of a diagnosis of dementia, in this case, Alzheimer's disease, dementia, but not everyone. So I think it's important to keep in mind that not everybody wants to know. But the thing that's unfortunate is that oftentimes people, even though they want to know, are not told that they have a diagnosis, either by their healthcare provider, or sometimes even by specialists. And so we are trying to encourage healthcare clinicians to become more comfortable with giving this diagnosis, but recognizing that this is not a diagnosis to be taken lightly. Most people are very afraid of this diagnosis. And if this diagnosis is actually the appropriate one, it's important to think about how to give it in a way that's filled with compassion, that provides support, and that provides guidance for the future. So why go forward with getting a diagnosis? Because diagnosis actually is power. It enables us the opportunity to plan for what's ahead, to communicate what's important to us while we can, to make sure that we have identified people who can speak on our behalf if we get to the point where we can't. And it also gives us the opportunity to ask what kind of legacy we want to leave. So when we wait until things are, so far down the road that those opportunities are no longer available for someone living with dementia, we've kept them from having that opportunity to share what's important to them. It's also important because it helps the caregiver know what to do. Informed caregivers are really able to navigate the future better. They're able to connect up with other networks and care providers. If you know, for example, that your loved one has Lewy body dementia and it has some peculiar or particular aspects of the illness that are unique, then connecting with others who also have Lewy body dementia or frontotemporal dementia or early onset dementia or vascular dementia can be reassuring and also give you some additional tools and skills that you need. So knowledge can be not only power, but it also can be loving towards those who are around us who also need to have useful and accurate information. The last thing I would say is that we are now getting a number of very promising treatments for dementia. And the earlier we have a diagnosis, especially if we even are in the realm of what's called mild cognitive impairment, the more likely we may be appropriate for or eligible for studies that might actually mitigate against the illness and potentially slow the process. So when there is a diagnosis, then it's worth thinking about what's next. And many of the things that we like to know are listed here. And this comes from a study that we did with quite a few caregivers who were caregivers of a number of people living with dementia, along with persons living with dementia who were early enough in their journey that they could give us their perspectives. And what they told us is they wanted to know what the disease course might look like, recognizing that part of the disease course of dementia is one that's predicated on uncertainty, but they wanted to know that. They also wanted to know about the fact that dementia actually was a serious illness and an illness that can eventually take our life, even though many people who have dementia also die from other comorbid conditions. They also wanted to know about safety issues, how to keep things from going awry, how to prevent crises where people get lost or where people can be harmed through exploitation, financial exploitation, how to navigate behavioral changes that often are part of the dementia illness journey, and then how to navigate the challenge itself of caregiving. And then for many of us, we are astonished by some of the financial and legal implications of the diagnosis of dementia. Being able to think about that early on, to be able to think of it in a clear-eyed way and to have a game plan going forward is also a gift for everybody, both for that person living with dementia and those who are caring for them. So now you have the diagnosis. Suddenly you find yourself in a new role. The pictures here are the pictures from my lived experience, and I want to hear from Judy's experience, but you can see here early on a picture of me and my father. And as I mentioned to you, he was really somebody I learned a great deal from and was always inspired by. And the second picture you see is when he had then been diagnosed with dementia, and our role changed. And I had to get used to a different role that was not the role that I had for many, many decades with him. And likewise for my mother, who's basically, for whom my husband was sort of the sun around which she orbited, her role also changed, and she had to navigate the change in that role. Judy, tell us about what that was like for you.
Sure. So Steve and I had always been on an even keel as partners. And from the moment he was diagnosed, I knew that the ground was shifting. Post-diagnosis, Steve had emphasized the fact that we were blessed with such a special kind of love, and we would always try to focus on that gift to carry us through the journey. And while he was still capable of doing much at that point, I knew that he was grappling with an enormously life-altering diagnosis. And I needed to step up as a care partner. I needed to take over our finances and organize our social life and begin creating a care plan to accommodate this new normal. I wanted to strategize a plan that would offer him success, and I became the navigator. We leaned heavily on the Alzheimer's Association, attended a memory cafe, joined a support group, and began advocating on state and federal levels. And we learned more about research opportunities. This offered us a chance to gain some control over some things in life at a time when we felt we were losing control. I tried in this new role to always embrace the aspects of our relationship that had not changed at that point yet, while I was assuming the shift of care partner to caregiver.
Thanks, Judy. And I think there are so many things that you described that are sort of important in navigating this new role. It requires adaptation and adjustment, and for many, a whole new set of skills. What is this role like? Well, by and large, it is a role that is played by a growing number of people in the United States. And many of those roles are adopted by women, but not exclusively so by both spousal partners and by adult children. And about a third of people who are caregivers are in the last third of their life. And essentially the sort of breakdown of caregiving in the United States reflects the dementia prevalence in the United States as well. You know, what we hear from dementia caregivers is that it's a bittersweet experience. It can be associated with high prevalence of depression and anxiety. We know that depression risk can increase as cognitive impairment worsens in the person with dementia. But we also hear from a lot of folks, and I think this is really important in terms of navigating the caregiver journey, and you'll hear it both from Judy and me more than once, is that it is easy for social isolation to occur. You know, some folks are not as comfortable with the dementia journey, and they may suddenly just stop showing up. They may not sort of be there for you in the same way as they have been in the past. And if that's the case, it becomes incredibly important to be intentional about social connection and really reaching out and finding new people who are in the same place or who are navigating some of the same issues so that you don't become isolated, because this is a very common trend. The other thing that's very common is family conflict, which is why one of the things that we'll talk about in a minute is the importance of planning ahead. Because, you know, if there was family conflict before the diagnosis of dementia, which, you know, oftentimes there is in families, it often can be exacerbated in the crisis of this new diagnosis, and also in some of the caregiving challenges and needs. And even in the most well-functioning families, it can be difficult for those who are not in the central caregiving role to be attuned to to the needs of those who are in that central caregiving role. I remember, because I took care of my father in my home, that my siblings who lived in other states, they really meant and wanted to be supportive, but it really required a lot of communication, I would say, proactive communication on my part, to be able to make sure that they were able to support my father and also me. And then, it's always a difficult journey because there's so much change going in the relationship itself that it can lead to frustration on our part as caregivers. And that those feelings of frustration can lead to us saying things or doing things that we're unhappy about. And those feelings of guilt are also very common among caregivers. There's also this ongoing grief that's occurring while this person is navigating the illness of dementia. And that is true for any serious illness. I think the thing that's unique about dementia is that the kind of grief that often people experience is unique because people are often losing parts of their loved one that were important to them, in real time while they're caring for them. And here's a couple of quotes talking about this one woman talking about her husband with frontotemporal dementia. He's irreplaceable, and one could say that about someone they love. I know that, but I also know, having worked with so many people over the years and being an educator for 40 years, that he's extraordinary. I can't go forward and think of the loss I'm going to have because when I go there, I'm deeply saddened. So for this particular caregiver, navigating that grief, sort of going there, but also having to live in it, was its own challenge with the caregiving journey. And then, there are many positive aspects of caregiving, and I think it's really important for us to talk about those positive aspects as too. It can give us a different kind of new meaning and purpose. It gives us the opportunity to master new roles and responsibilities that we then have and can share with others. It can have a fulfilling impact for us spiritually, and often predicated on our own religious influences and backgrounds. For many of us, it is part of fulfilling our vow and something we feel deeply committed to. There can be a different kind of togetherness when you're together in a place of presence in the moment, knowing that that moment is the moment. It may not be remembered by your loved one in the next moment, but in that moment, it is a good moment. It can promote physical activity, and there is a satisfaction that can come with both having this new sense of meaning and purpose and also helping others. So given that what we now have navigated this new role, then I think it's worth thinking about caring as a new skill. Many of us have different caregiving roles as we evolve as people. We might have been in some sort of teaching role, or it's kind of caregiving role. We might have had children. We might have had other family members or people who are like children in our life that we've cared for. We might have even cared for other neighbors. Regardless, when one becomes the primary caregiver for another person, there are new skills to be learned. Judy, what were some of those new skills for you?
Well, adjusting to what I referred to as false facts, and as Steve would come out with at times, and not correcting him every time he stated something that wasn't completely true, was really a learning curve for me. In our old life, we could often help each other to remember a story accurately and say something like, no, remember it happened this way, or that wasn't the timeline, or say something like, no, don't you remember I told you we were going to do this last week? Well, statements like that now felt cruel and like I was highlighting the challenges that accompany this disease. And I will admit, it is a disease that can certainly test one's patience. Meeting people where they are in that moment needs to be at the forefront of situations that arise. I recall one day in particular where I was feeling overwhelmed and Steve was following me around the house very closely. I stepped into the bathroom for a moment to obtain some space and take a deep breath. When I opened the door, there he was, standing right there. I looked him in the eye and could see this beautiful person who hadn't asked for this disease or the symptoms that accompany it. He was just looking to me for some support. He entrusted me with the sacred role of being the steward of his care. This was a real aha moment for me. And like Christine said, an acknowledgement of a time to live out your vows. At other times later in the trajectory of his disease, when Steve would get agitated and say, "Come on, I want to go home. Let's go home," I would try to meet him where he was in that very moment and say, "Okay, no, I want to go home too. Let's sit for a few minutes and gather ourselves, and then we'll go." And usually stopping and changing the pace was enough to return to our baseline of calm. I aspired, didn't always do, but I aspired to remember that he wasn't trying to give me a hard time at times like this. He was having a hard time. I also realized that tending to my emotions as a caregiver was vital to survival. I was losing my partner, and there was profound sadness that accompanied that knowledge. I would have a morning meditation or a song to settle my anxiety, and I would realize that my mood very possibly could dictate how our entire went. Also, as a caregiver, I realized that some of my most successful days were the ones when I said, "I need help. I can't do this alone."
Thank you, Judy. So much inspiration there, and so much good learning. And one of the things I think for many of us that's challenging around caring and caregiving for someone living with dementia is how much of it, as Judy just articulated, is the not verbal part. It's the being part, it's the presence part, it's the tone, it's all those things that are not the words. And the words can trigger us because we're still living by words. And yet for our loved one, the words may be less of what they understand than what are those other things, which is the sense of calm, the sense of presence, the sense of love, the sense of compassion. And that is a true change for many of us, especially those of us who've lived our whole life based on words. So probably one of the first things to think about, and we alluded to this earlier, is sort of figuring out what is most important in two different ways, both in terms of sort of thinking about the future and trying to think about what you know of your care recipient about what's important to them, and trying to sort of harness that sense of what's important in the way life is done. And at the same time, what is important for that moment. And that moment may look very different than what is important as the day goes on. And I think for many of us who are very accomplishment oriented and achievement oriented, thinking about what is important in the moment, which oftentimes is being present in a place of love and compassion, both for the person we're caring for and for ourselves, that is the growth edge for many of us, certainly for me. And when I had the privilege of caring for my father in my home, and he would be anxious and agitated, being able to use Judy's terms, recognize that he wasn't giving me a hard time, that he was having a hard time, enabled me to be present in that moment and realize that what was needed for him in that moment was a sense of presence and a sense of connection. The other thing that we've alluded to is learning new ways to communicate. So for many people, as their language no longer becomes their anchor for how they evaluate threats in the world, they're evaluating threats in the world based on other more subtle and often primal forms of familiarity or lack of familiarity. And so how we communicate often will be one where the person who we're caring for is evaluating in their head, is this friendly or is this a foe? And if we pull someone into the bathtub and say it's time to take a shower, we're likely considered faux. We are probably not considered that person's friend. Or if we say things in words that are too complicated, or say things that are that sound condescending or disrespectful or erosive of somebody's dignity, we are likely to be perceived as faux. So thinking about how we can come forward as a friend, as someone who's coming to be supportive in peace, in respect, supporting that person's dignity, is a new way of thinking about communication. And oftentimes the language is the least of it. It's a piece of it, but even there, it's keeping it simple and keeping it focused. So focusing, this is from some of the skills that we talk about in our Dementia Care Collaborative, but it's the whole idea of focusing on feelings and not words, which is, and Judy described this so eloquently, offering comfort and reassurance, and then joining in this person's reality. My father, as I mentioned to you, was a surgeon. And with some regularity, he would go on rounds around our kitchen table and tell the rest of us what we needed to do. My husband was the best at entering into my father's reality. And when he was told to go get an x-ray on that patient, he would say, I'll go right ahead and do that. He entered into his reality. He treated my father with respect, and he was able to respond to the emotions behind the words in that story, which for my father was maintaining some sense of control. Distractions can be challenging. And for many people, when we find, for example, if we take them to a busy, loud restaurant, for example, they may become agitated. We wonder why. It's good food. It's good, it's a good environment. There may be distractions that are hard for them, for that particular person. And for each person, that's going to look different. So knowing your care recipient, your care partner, and identifying what are those distractions which are not serving them or serving you in the relationship can be really important. Judy mentioned this as well. Trying to convince someone that they actually don't have it right generally doesn't go over well. Actually, I think it doesn't go over very well, even for people who are not living with dementia, but certainly for people living with dementia, trying to say, well, I told you like for the 5th time that your doctor's appointment is tomorrow, probably isn't going to go over well. It's communicating, again, that sort of lack of of course, it's communicating understandable frustration, but also from that person who's receiving it, a sense of being put down or a sense of lack of respect. So really focusing on how our words and our being are communicated as feelings as opposed to words can be a useful pivot for many of us. Some helpful sort of verbal communication tips is to use short, simple words and sentences. I see this a lot in the healthcare setting where we as clinicians will use incredibly complex commands for people, and it's very hard for people to follow. If you ask someone to do 3 different things and really their ability is one thing at most, that just can serve as a source of frustration. Being patient on waiting for a response, sometimes, not always, offering a guess or suggestion can be helpful. Sometimes for certain people that can feel condescending. You know your care recipient best on that one. It's useful to turn negatives into positives, and I loved many of Judy's examples of that. And then sometimes making statements rather than asking questions can be helpful. So it sounds like the weather was good today, or it sounds like you went to the day center today. I'm guessing that was a good experience for you. Things that don't require people to dredge up things that they actually are feeling uncomfortable about or don't remember. And then for some, being able to write things down can be very helpful. Now, there are a whole host of behavioral symptoms that are part of the lived experience for people living with dementia. And here are the most common: depression, psychosis, And for some, especially people with Lewy body dementia, that can occur early, where people will see things that other people don't see. Oftentimes people will see other people or animals or whatever in the room. It's not bothering them, but they see things that are not visible to the rest of us. Apathy. You can have people who've been hard driving, corporate executives who, when they develop dementia, just frankly don't give a care in the world. And this can also be a big adjustment for family members. Aggression, delusions, thinking that somebody has stole their things because they can't remember where they are, sleep disturbances, and wandering. For my father, sleep disturbances was a big thing. And my husband and I would take turns basically at night, knowing that he would be up probably half the night. And we would take turns just making sure that he was safe and that he felt supported and comforted as he sometimes got his days and nights mixed up. The DICE approach, for some of you who may not be familiar with it, it was developed by Laura Gitlin and Helen Kales, and it's this evidence-based approach towards navigating some of these behavioral symptoms. What it does is it enables us to evaluate what environmental factors may be precipitating a particular behavior, and then developing strategies to mitigate against them. Now, I'll say not all of these things can be mitigated against just based on environmental changes, but many can be. And so then it can be useful to sort of say, okay, first of all, sort of what's happening, describing it. Second, investigating what could be going on. Could this be a medication? Could this person be in pain? Are there other things that are going on in terms of sleep or sensory changes or feeling out of control in a particular instance that's contributing to this? And then also sort of evaluating our own responses. Are there things that we might be doing that are inadvertently contributing to this? This is why, again, getting input from other people can be so valuable. Then creating a plan to test a different approach, almost, again, sort of like an N of one study or a clinical trial, and seeing how that does with changing the behavior and then evaluating it. So it's basically sort of an iterative approach towards managing a number of behavioral symptoms, which for many people they've taken this and done incredibly well with navigating some of those approaches. And Judy sort of described some of the things that she did to navigate some of Steve's behaviors as well. The other thing is to keep in mind that behaviors are, in a way, a kind of communication. And so if we can think of them as a communication, then we can ask ourselves, what are they telling us? And maybe, again, they're telling us that person is in pain, or that person is uncomfortable, or that person is uncomfortable in the environment. So considering them rather than sort of just a source of frustration, which they often can be, but more as a source of communication, can give us the opportunity to figure out a way to navigate them. So how do we navigate some of these changes that we experience as a caregiver, and some of the skills? I would say it's a combination of things. And the first is to be confident in your capabilities. These are muscles, and the more you use them, the more you'll build them and become strong in them. And also do those things that will help you be able to be relaxed. Judy talked about going into the bathroom, just giving herself a minute. I think that's important. Taking sometimes just a minute or two and taking 5 deep breaths and saying, you know what, I'm not alone in this experience. Other people are in this experience. This is a challenging experience. And I'm going to both ask for help, as Judy has also suggested, and I'm going to remember some of those tools and try them out in this situation and see how they go. And then keeping in mind sort of these 3 tools that can be useful in the moment, which is reassurance, avoiding that word no, acknowledging the emotion behind whatever is being said, redirecting, thinking about some sort of distraction or something else that is beneficial or lovely or positive for that person, and then distracting and thinking about how to engage other senses, smell, taste, the wind in our face, something that's nice music, all of these things that can serve as a distraction and help in that moment move that person from a place of distress to a place of more calm. And know that, what works one time is not necessarily going to work every time. So sometimes you do need to know when to walk away. Sometimes it's knowing when to get help. Sometimes it's, my mother used to take my father loved milkshakes, and that was often the distraction. And he was a beanpole, so I don't know where all those milkshakes went, but sometimes it's the distraction that can also be really helpful. And then I think the other thing that's important to keep in mind is that there's no, the way we communicate is matters here. And we've sort of said this more than one times, but attending to our tone. I'm still struck that probably tone is the one thing that is probably the most kind of easy to move into sort of a space that doesn't serve us well. And when we can master our tone and stay in that place of compassion, again, both to that person and to ourselves, amazing things can happen. I think the other thing that's really important to keep in mind is that, and Judy said this beautifully, this is the disease that's going on here. It is not your loved one. It's not your care recipient, your care partner. And so keeping in mind that it is the disease that are causing these changes and not them can help sometimes serve as a disconnect. This is much harder, right, than thinking about some other diseases where they feel more tangible. This one is so sort of closely linked to personality that it can be harder to keep track of as being separate. And then I cannot emphasize this enough. It is so important to show yourself compassion, to remember that you are not alone, to remember that being and feeling inadequate is just part of all of our lived common humanity. And that sometimes we have to do what we need other people to do for us as well, which is to say, what would I say to somebody else who's in this situation? I would say, oh my gosh, that sounds really hard. No wonder you are frustrated, and show that same kind of kindness to ourselves. So our last section is on difficult choices. And Judy, I'd love to hear from you about some of the difficult choices that you had to navigate.
Sure. And I'm not good about making choices, especially difficult ones. But from the moment of Steve's diagnosis, I could imagine that we would be faced with difficult choices along the way. Starting with smaller ones, deciding which social interactions work best for Steve, whittling down his wardrobe so that to make choosing clothing easier for him, and then making sure eventually that clothing was easy to get off and on, would be comfortable, was really important. These were choices that made a difference in our life. And also having day wear that could roll into night wear when someone was sundowning and not having to say, you got to get in pajamas. So, but the difficult choices that were really hard and never easy for anyone was when it came time, was it time for Steve to attend a day program? How would people be able to take care of him the way I took care of him? And thank goodness, Steve had a wonderful memory specialist, Dr. Teresa Gomez Isla, and she let me know when that time came. And when I knew that Steve would not, buy into this or want to go, I had her write a prescription that I kept in the car. And I would say to Steve, I know, I don't want you to go either, but Dr. Teresa said you have to go. And he'd say, okay. And then skilled nursing care. This was something that we never planned. We had always imagined Steve would stay home until he couldn't any longer. But I also knew that he would trust whatever my judgment was. And it was not something I'm prepared for. But when it became clear that we could no longer meet his health needs at home, and we had kind of an unfortunate situation where he had to go through the gates of an emergency room and a geri-psychiatry unit and then into the nursing home, it made me realize I wish I had planned for this sooner. And then he was at this skilled nursing facility that I kind of had to find in a very short time, and lived there for the next 5 months of his life. Steve and I couldn't ever imagine or discuss life without one another. So end of life discussions were something we always managed to skirt and avoid. But fortunately, I knew what his wants and desires were. I think it's easier with a spouse maybe than with a parent or a friend. So I think these are issues that are so important to discuss. I knew Steve would not want extraordinary measures. I knew that he wouldn't want to be treated for pneumonia if he was close to death. So these are important discussions to have. And, as I look back, and hindsight is 20/20, as they say, and try to offer perspective to others on this journey, I can't encourage you enough to have these discussions about difficult choices that will lay ahead enough. And there are so many resources, even more so now than there was 5 years ago, to help guide these difficult decisions. And I just encourage people, you're very vulnerable. Vulnerability can also open you up to other resources that will fall into your life. Be vulnerable, ask the questions, ask the uncomfortable questions. It's okay to cry. It's okay to say, I'm not okay, but ask these questions and try to plan.
Thank you, Judy. So as Judy said, there are so many difficult choices. And I would venture to say that, in my care for many people with all different kinds of clinical conditions, I do believe that people living with dementia in some respects and their families have some of the most complex choices to navigate, and many that come up on us unawares. This is a study that was done a few years back where we looked at across the country at people living with dementia who were living in the community. And we were surprised to find that actually compared to people who didn't have dementia, these are all older adults, people over the age of 65, that people living with dementia were less likely to have an advance directive or to have an end-of-life discussion with them or their care partner. And so I think to Judy's point, it's never comfortable to have these kind of conversations. And yet early on, when someone is still able to have those conversations, it's worth going through the pain and discomfort of quote unquote going there, when frankly, none of us really do want to go there. This organization, Prepare for Your Care, is a national organization that offers advance directives for every state in the country. And they've just developed a new tool that I wanted you to be aware of called Prepare for Their Care. And it's essentially an advanced care planning tool for caregivers. And would love to hear your thoughts about it if any of you use it. But I think it's to Judy's point, there are more and more sort of tools that are now out there for us to think about some of these decisions as we go down this path. And as Judy alluded, they're all different settings of care. And like Judy, I had this wish that I would be able to care for my father in his last days in my home. And that wish was not fulfilled. And it became clear that he too ultimately would need to be in a nursing facility. And again, I wished that I had been a little bit more proactive in my planning, even as somebody who's a geriatrician and a palliative care physician, so that I had a little bit more clarity about sort of what kind of nursing facilities would make the most sense for what his needs were. Here's some books that may be of benefit to you. They're ones that are ones that I often go to, or went to, I should say, in the past. And there are many more that are out there that are sort of growing with each day that I think can be extremely valuable tools. Many of you may be familiar with the book that I grew up with early on in my career, which is The 36-Hour Day. It's also another book that is commonly used for caregiving. We also have a roadmap series through the Massachusetts Alzheimer's Disease Research Center that Christine Brown, our host, one of our hosts for today's, helped create, that's on caregiving. So lots of tools out there to avail yourself of. So just to sum up then, it can be tough when you start seeing signs that something's not right. We'd encourage you to go ahead and do the hard work of seeking a diagnosis. Embrace this new role, recognize it's a new role, though there will be adaptation that's required with it. There will be new caregiving skills, lots of difficult choices along the way. Seek support, seek all of us who are in this shared space with you. Don't go it alone, and know that this can have, bittersweet though it may be, many places of joy that can also buoy us along as we go through this journey of caregiving. And with that, I will stop sharing, and we are happy to answer questions.